My Lords, I regret that we heard the Home Secretary and now the Minister accept the principle of the Opposition's fast-track public space protection orders in relation to Motion H, and using that to justify broader anti-protest amendments as a balance in protecting non-protesters. I regret this, but I'm not surprised, because the danger of advocating any measures that strengthen anti-protest measures sets a tone that suggests that some protesters are good, some protesters are bad, and this politicises a general and universal right that I think we should defend. With that to one side, I want to oppose the government's doubling down on a noise trigger and follow on, particularly from the remarks made by the Noble Baroness Jones, but others who have expressed their opposition so well. I want to make a nod to the democratic dilemma of this ping-pong, whether we are actually blocking democracy. When summing up at the rejection of the second tranche of anti-protest amendments at report stage, the Noble Baroness Williams chided us all who had opposed those amendments for ignoring the public's demand that authorities deal with new forms of protest activities, such as those that we've seen used by Extinction Rebellion and its offspring, such as Insulate Britain. And whilst I disagreed that those particular amendments would have dealt with those new forms of protest, and I thought, in fact, that those particular amendments were so broad that they would have swept up all and any protests, including, for example, anyone who might have wanted to protest against net zero, for example, on a different side politically from Extinction Rebellion. Despite that, and despite the fact that the state already has huge powers, whether it's the Emergency Workers Obstruction Act or the Public Order Act that we've heard about, that could have actually been used to deal with these particularly nuisance forms of protest as the public would have it. Despite that, I did feel, at least, that the government were responding to a particular form of protest of which there has been some public agitation, some concern, and therefore that chiding was listened to. But now, here we are, with the government amendments on protest that bear absolutely no relationship with the Home Office's motivation in relation to new forms of protest. And I just don't think the government has a democratic mandate for these particular amendments. When it comes to fundamental and foundational democratic rights, such as the right to assemble, or the right to protest, or the right to free speech, these should really be protected by an iron curtain. And if there's any attempt at undermining those rights, the presumption must rest with the government to justify in absolutely clear terms, within its sense of the absolute exceptional reasons for proposed changes, in order to justify any more draconian measures being brought in. And it just doesn't add up, because as I've noticed before, even these new type of protests that are apparently upsetting the public are often silent. So the noise trigger doesn't apply to them whatsoever in any way. The authorities should only ever consider proposing accruing further power when they're limiting the right to assembly and ultimately limit the right to free speech in exceptional circumstances. And I think in this instance there just isn't those exceptional circumstances. But what I find even more galling in terms of a kind of smoke and mirrors is posing these proposals as protecting the public from the consequence of protest. The public are described as non-protesters, but as I think the Noble Baroness Jones pointed out, this turns people into two different groups of people. But actually, the public are the people who go on protests. They might not go on all of the protests all of the times, but it's their right as the public that we're talking about. Because I think there's an Alice in Wonderland approach here that gets the issues upside down and implies that the government are far removed from the reality that over centuries has meant that free protest was of crucial importance for the public. The denial of that right, whether it's in Putin's Russia or China's Hong Kong, should be a visceral reminder to us here about why protest matters, and that's protest, warts and all. Of course, not all protests are popular, and many of the modern protests that I've mentioned, such as those by Extinction Rebellion, I don't support, and they irritate me. But like all fundamental democratic rights, free speech, free association and so on, it doesn't matter whether they're annoying or unpleasant or you object, or even if those demonstrations are directed in a hostile way against what you believe to be true. We can't pick and choose which speech or which protests we agree with and then only endorse the ones that we like. And we have to make sure that we don't let those kind of political prejudices get in the way. We're bound to feel uncomfortable at times when people protest for things that we disagree with. But that's freedom for you. Living in a free society has never claimed to be safe and cosy. It is designed to make you, on occasion, feel uncomfortable. But there are principles here, because as the Court of Appeal notes, protest becomes effectively worthless if the protester's choice of when and where to protest is not respected as far as possible. And I stand by that. Finally, I think that we should, if anything, be doing something in this House to facilitate civil society having the freedom to stand up to power and to encourage the public not only to have their right to be heard and their right to be heard loudly protected, but we should, if anything, encourage voters to actively engage in extra parliamentary activity and to shout as loudly as possible about what concerns them, because that way we'll get to actually hear some of that public debate. And it's also a safety valve for democracy. If that causes inconvenience or annoyance or is too loud, we will survive, and democracy will be better for it, even if on occasion annoyed. To finish, I want to quote a participant from the Citizens' Assembly on democracy, because I think it sums up what's at stake. When civil society or minority groups or opinions are ignored by politicians, it is the British way to assemble or march with an exuberant voice, carrying placards and symbols of protest. Peaceful protest sheds light on the mood of the nation and informs the elected representatives, and dare I say it, the unelected representatives, of the strength of opinion residing outside their bubble or chosen focus group. And I say hear, hear to that, and loudly.